Hello. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. You guys are amazing for staying with us and being part of this conversation. So now we've got the second part of the intersection of performance and archives and the last dialogue of our conference. I'm really excited by this panel. I'll introduce them in order. Oskar Eustis has served as the artistic director of the Public Theater since 2005, after serving as the artistic director at Trinity Repertory Company in Providence, Rhode Island from 1994 to 2005. Throughout his career, Oskar has been dedicated to the development of new work that speaks to the great issues of our time and has worked with countless artists in pursuit of that aim, including Tony Kushner, Susan-Lori Parks, David Henry Hwang, Lin-Manuel Miranda, Richard Nelson, Reen Groff, Terrell Alvin McCraney, and Lisa Krohn. He is currently a professor at New York University and has held professorships at UCLA, Middlebury College, and Brown University. He's slightly underaccomplished. Michelle Dowd is the Hudson Strode Professor of English and Director of the Hudson Strode Program at the University of Alabama. She is the author of Women's Work in Early Modern English Literature and Culture, which won the Sarah A. Whaley Book Award from the National Women's Studies Association. She's also the author of The Dynamics of Inheritance on the Shakespearean Stage. I'm not going to read all your co-edited books. There's a lot of it's like all in italics here. So a lot of amazing co-edited books. Most recently, she co-edited the Arden Handbook of Shakespeare and Early Modern Drama, which is forthcoming in 2023. She has published numerous journal articles as well in all the top presses. She is the editor of a new book series, The Strode Studies in Early Modern Literature and Culture, which is published by the University of Alabama Press, and she's currently serving a 3-year term as a trustee of the Shakespeare Association of America. She's also underaccomplished. It's too long to read, that's how accomplished it is. And finally, last but not least, Ian Smith is the Richard H. Jr. 60 and Joan K. Sell Professor in the Humanities in the Department of English at Lafayette College. He is the author of Race and Rhetoric in Renaissance England, Barbarian Errors, and a collaborator on Othello Reimagined and Sepia. His recent monograph, which was just published last week and I describe it as a book with flames coming out of it, is called Black Shakespeare, Reading and Misreading Race. Has been published in the UK and will soon appear in the US. He is the recipient of multiple fellowships in support of his scholarship and is currently the Los Angeles Times Distinguished Fellow in the History and Culture of the Americas here at the Huntington Library. He is also the Vice President of the Shakespeare Association of America, which means that next year he will be the President. Thank you all for being here. So continuing the thread of learning our origin stories, fantasies, myths, fictions, I wondered if you all would be willing to share your earliest experiences with Shakespeare, either on the stage or in the archives or in the classroom, and if you can connect that with what you're doing today or what you aspire to do. Ian, would you like to start?
Hello? Yes, great, thank you. Thank you, Ayanna. Yes, I will try. I think there are two things I might talk about. Is that okay? Can I do two?
Absolutely.
Okay. I remember I read Shakespeare in high school, like most of us, I suspect. But the story that really stayed with me is reading Othello in university. Now, I went to university in Jamaica at the University of West Indies. I say that because it's a predominantly black country, although we have multiple races, ethnicities as well, right? But I say that because of the story that's going to come. And of course, Jamaica was colonized by the British. And so here I was studying Othello, and I remember writing this paper, being very excited about trying to talk about dramatic structure in Othello and, trying to discover the play for myself, et cetera, et cetera. And that was great. Now, several years later, as I continued to think about the play, I realized that something very strange had happened. That at university, being taught by a wonderful man who was Irish, who came to live in Jamaica after the war and stayed there until retirement and so on, it occurred to me that I was not brought into any conscious awareness that Othello was black. And it shocked me, it disturbed me, it embarrassed me that I could have stayed with the play for so long during my undergraduate years and beyond until I got to graduate school and didn't really come to grips with the fact that here was a black character. Growing up in the Caribbean, as I said, going to school, where I went to school, and I thought, how could this be? Now, at the time I just knew it was strange, but I couldn't sort of figure out what that really was. And so Ayanna mentioned, I just finished working on a project, and it was only a couple nights ago as I was thinking about this conference, it occurred to me that that experience really is part of what I was working through in that last project. And that last project was in fact about what I call a white epistemology, the ways in which the histories, our institutions, our cultural systems create a set of lens for us to see through, which prevent us from seeing certain things and create blind spots for us. So there was a big blind spot that I couldn't see, that here was this black man in this most famous play. And I think that, I can say more later on, but it's just interesting to me that as someone who grew up the way I grew up, such a thing could happen. And here I was so many years later, trying to work that through in the context of Shakespeare scholarship today and the sort of difficulties we continue to face. So that's one story. The second one is, I was a young person running around in Stratford-on-Avon, at some point. Somebody else mentioned a story about being in Stratford too earlier today. I think it was...
It was me.
And again, Othello once again strikes. And this was Donald Sinden playing the role of Othello. And this was 1979, 1980. And one of the great excitements at the time was they had figured out a way to use some sort of new chemical theme to darken Donald Sinden's skin, i.e. blackface, Shakespearean blackface, but in a way that would avoid the sort of things that had happened before. That is, the thing rubbing off on the other actors, rubbing off on his clothing and so on. So in effect, the skin was dyed and it would last for 4 days. Oh my God. So as you walked around town, Stratford is a fairly small town, you would see him on the streets after the performance and he would still be stained dark because it lasted 4 days. Again, as somebody, as we'd heard before, I remember seeing that, and I remember that registering for some reason. And once again, that story is part of the reason why I'm here currently at the Huntington, because one of the things that I'm still trying to think through is, how do we imagine what early moderns did for black actors on the stage? So I was thrilled to hear this morning someone suggests that perhaps Rosaline might be a black actor. That's interesting. But in the absence of that, our knowledge is that they were white actors, and they would in fact use different ways of impersonating blackness. And that's what I'm working on at the moment. So the short answer is, I'm still haunted in some way by that question. And I remember too at one point in graduate school asking a Shakespearean, what did they do? And I asked the question thinking I was the only one in the world who didn't know the answer. So I thought, okay, the sort of insecure graduate student not knowing what the answer is. And then when he said, I don't know, I thought, whoa, interesting. Mm-hmm. So I was the only person who didn't know, and I thought, okay, I need to know what that looks like. So here I am today, trying to now bring all that together to sort of provide some sort of response for myself and hopefully for others, readers and for students, about what it means to do what some have called early modern blackface. I've called it that too, but more properly for me is what I call racial cross-dressing. And if you want to, we can talk about that later on as well. So those are my two stories.
Wow. And for those of you who don't know, Ian has two articles, or early articles, about the racial cross-dressing and some of what he calls racial prosthetics. If you think about what kinds of prosthetics were used on the early modern stage, some of it is cross-racial prosthetics as well. So his work has been unbelievably influential and significant. So, Michelle, how about you?
So my Shakespearean origin story is, I still find it kind of amusing to myself that this is how, it's sort of serendipitous and weird at the same time. But I was pretty young. I was 11 or so, maybe 12. And I think the summer before I saw the production I'm going to talk about, my parents had had a trip to London, and there's like, oh, do you want to see a show? And maybe we should see a Shakespeare show. And I actually said no, I didn't want to. That sounded boring. So we saw some musical or something. And then, so I had been interested in theater for a long time, but I really didn't have, interest in Shakespeare at that point. And I got home from that trip. It wasn't too much longer after that trip, and there was a production. So it was a televised production of a shot live theatrical performance of The Taming of the Shrew from the Stratford Festival in Ontario. And it starred Len Cariou as Petruchio. And the production was probably, I think, 81 or so, but it was later than that I saw it. I don't remember why I turned it on, why I was alone. It was just me. My parents weren't watching it. I just watched it. And for whatever reason, I decided to sit down and watch it, and I was completely transfixed by it. And I didn't know a lot of what they were saying. A lot of, the language kind of washed over me. I was captivated, though, by the back and forth, by the kind of intensity of the kind of wit. And I knew, even then, that there was something deeply troubling, right? I mean, it was a very kind of traditional production. So there was nothing like ironic in Kate's last speech or anything like that. So there was something about it that both gripped me and kind of, horrified me, and I didn't know how to talk about that. But I did become kind of obsessed with that production, and that's what also prompted me to get a complete works of Shakespeare, like a little $9.99, complete works of Shakespeare for my birthday, and read and go to see as much Shakespeare as I could after that. So really, honestly, that performance started me down the path to decide to, read Shakespeare more in detail and to study him in college. But what I think is interesting about that it happened to have been The Taming of the Shrew was that coming back to that, thinking about that all these years later, when I got to college and especially graduate school, and I really started exploring the text from a feminist perspective and thinking really deeply about feminist use of language, about the power dynamics in these plays, Taming of the Shrew obviously is a key text for thinking through some of those questions. And so even though when I was young, when I first saw this, I could not have articulated, any of those thoughts in detail, I think it was something about that kind of tension in that production between the kind of uproariousness of it. It was very interactive. You could see the actors engaging with people in the theater, which I found intriguing, and yet the ending, sat with me as kind of, wait, this is how the comedy ends? I didn't like it even then, although I didn't quite have the language to talk about it. So I think, and I would also say that, as I know Eric and other people said yesterday, that I think about that as a teacher too, about thinking about the first introduction one has to Shakespeare being theatrical, in some cases versus textual, and how most of my students when they come to college or grad school of course have interacted with Shakespeare as a text before, but many of them have not interacted with Shakespeare as a theater art at all. And so I try as best as I can to provide some of that experience for them, even if it's short or clips or video or whatever, because of that original experience I had. Because it's unclear to me if I would ever, have gone down the path I had if I hadn't seen a production that gripped me in that particular way.
Gosh, that's amazing. And I love the idea of, wait, this is what a comedy is, right? like who is it comedy for?
Right.
Oskar.
Well, I feel like I'm part of a large group of us who was, I believe, 13 years old. And I went to Stratford, but it was kind of unusual. I had a fairly tumultuous youth, and I'd actually sort of run away from home when we were living in Denmark for reasons I won't bore you with. And I got on board a freighter and went to Scotland, to Edinburgh, and then hitchhiked my way down the country, south, and stopped off in Stratford.
Wait, you ran away at 13?
Yeah.
To,
so Stratford,
to Scotland?
It was kind of fun, but no, actually, I should be honest. I was scared to death every minute, but I didn't act like it, did I? And it got to start because I'd heard about Stratford and I knew something about Shakespeare, and I could get a ticket. And Greg, you will probably know. I believe it was the Roman season. I believe it was 72. 71, 72. And was it Alan Howard playing Coriolanus?
It was Ian Hall.
There we go. So I'm a 13-year-old runaway, sitting as high up in the theater as I could get, watching this production of Coriolanus. And I will just never forget your voices. That speech just sort of electrified me. And I was still, however, a runaway, and I kept hitchhiking down to London. And I got another theater ticket, which was for the original British production of Hair. And at the end of Hair, at the invitation of the actors, I got up on stage and started dancing. And that period of time, that few weeks there, was, I think, sort of crucial to my whole development to my life. Because I actually felt like in both of these places, the theater is a place that I could belong. The theater is a place that could invite me in. And when I got back to Minnesota, which is where I did most of my growing up, I auditioned for John Donahue's Children's Theater Company, and indeed found then, as I have found ever since, that most of the things that make me, not likable outside of the theater, or not virtuous, in the theater they're virtuous. Mm-hmm. Minnesota boys were not supposed to cry as easily as I cried, but in the theater they thought that was great. And so that's it's certainly not as learned as my colleague's story, but that's my story of how Shakespeare started for me.
But I love this, I love asking people origin stories, but what's come across from the past 2 days is that 12, 13 is the magic year. And, hey, if you're listening, Jeff Bezos, maybe you want to fund 13-year-olds to go to see some Shakespeare somewhere near them, right? What could we do differently in the world if everyone got to see Shakespeare at 12 or 13?
Well, part of that, there's been a theme, I think, for all of the conferences that I've heard and for most of the discussions I have about Shakespeare. Who's invited? who actually gets to feel like they own Shakespeare, who is invited not only to witness, but to participate in and work with and manhandle Shakespeare. And to me, that's the whole key of it. There's nothing wrong about Shakespeare that collective ownership wouldn't fix. As long as we figure out a way to make him everybody's property, he's a great author to work with. If we can't figure out how to do that, then it becomes yet another way of creating dividing lines of who's in and who's out.
I just want to pause to see if either of you wanted to jump in. No? Okay. Well, so I think I'll start with you, Oskar, because this segues from what you just said, but what conversations did you have at the public after the summer of reckoning and the COVID closures? And I mean, that's a lot, right? But what organizations did your organization want or pledge to make? And how difficult was that?
Oh, it was very difficult, and it remains difficult, because I think I would never pretend that we're at the end of figuring out the appropriate way to respond to this historical moment. There's a whole series of demands that were put on me and on us as an organization that has always prided itself on being a progressive and inclusive organization from the very beginning. And it was tough to have the mirror held up and realized, right, we're progressive within a certain envelope. We are inclusive within a certain envelope. And basically we're being asked right now to blow up the edges, walls, edges, my metaphors are bad, but change, and that's, and we've been trying to do it, and it's been really hard and really exciting. And the two things I would just say briefly is, one of the things that was very clear was a critique, which I completely accepted, was that I had become far too privatized in my decision-making, and therefore people felt that it was not transparent and not clear, and that they couldn't buy into what the public was doing because it was too much what I was saying. And that was an absolutely correct critique of my last, 5-6 years before the pandemic. So I created an artistic leadership team, which is now a beautiful group of people, and every major decision that the theater makes, certainly decisions about programming and directors and even down to casting, gets made with a group of people around the table. I still have final accountability, but everybody in that group gets to voice their opinions and therefore gets to own what the decision is. And I frankly almost never have had to go, okay, well, I'm deciding now, because that's been fantastic. It's opened my eyes. Again, I think that mirror was held up, and I didn't like everything I saw, and this is a better way of working. Mm-hmm. But the other thing I want to just say, because of the nature of this conference, is there's, of course, with the New York Shakespeare Festival and the Public Theater, we started as the New York Shakespeare Festival, so there's, of course, immediately an above-board, very animated, lively, ferocious discussion about why are we privileging Shakespeare? Why are we doing Shakespeare at the, because basically what we do is Shakespeare and new plays. Occasionally there's some other, but that's coming. And, it was tough. And Sahim Ali, who is the Associate Artistic Director and really kind of a brilliant man, said, you know what, let me call an all-staff meeting and discuss this. And Sahim is Kenyan, and he just started the meeting by talking for 10 minutes about what Shakespeare had meant to him as a boy growing up in Kenya. And then the discussion that happened among the staff was so beautiful, so nuanced, so complicated, and all of the sort of side-taking, confrontative, nasty dialogue that we'd been in for the previous couple months just kind of melted away, and we were all grappling with that. And we've got a play on our stages right now, which we're co-doing with the Folger and Woolly Mammoth. Madeline Say, it's a beautiful play, Where We Belong, which is about her struggle as a Mohegan, studying Shakespeare, how those things...
In Stratford.
Yeah, you're getting a common denominator here, you Stratfordians. You're serving a service you didn't even know you were doing. And so now it feels like the status of Shakespeare and the use of Shakespeare is problematized and questioned, but again, in a way that is really creative and productive, and it's it's not simplistic, and I'm very grateful for that.
That's wonderful, thank you. Michelle, I wonder for your research center, you're in Alabama, which has a huge Black population that I don't know, this is an earnest question, I don't know how much they engage with the Strode Center, and were there conversations during the COVID closures and the Summer of Reckoning about what kind of programming you can and do perform there?
Yes, absolutely. And it might help just to give a bit of just quick context about the center, because we're kind of an unusual program, like unlike let's say the Arizona Center, we're not actually an interdisciplinary standalone center that is outside of a department. We are a degree granting program within the Department of English at the University of Alabama that is funded separately, or at least in part, through the Hudson Strode Endowment. And so the program is for graduate training, MA, PhD, and then we also have funds to support guest speakers and colloquium and a range of programming, including some performance programming, which I might talk more about later. So I would say, with the COVID closures and the Summer of Reckoning 2020, I mean, in some ways our first commitment and our first responsibility was to students in our program, right? And thinking about community, ways of sustaining community, ways of making sure that students had what they needed, even if we were, remote or inaccessible in certain ways. And so that was sort of one sort of more practical, I guess, but very urgent arm of that. Of course, most of our programming had to, in the summer of 2020, programming stopped, but we shifted to online, as of course almost everyone did in some capacity. But we did have a series of conversations in the summer of 2020 among the Strode faculty in conjunction with the English department about taking this moment to think about better engaging. How could the Strode program be better engaged with the community, with the department at large, including undergraduates? That was one of our first point of contact, because the Strode program is traditionally has been exclusively a graduate program, and we don't have a lot of programming that's directly addressing undergraduates. And we wanted to start to shift that a bit, specifically around urgent questions such as race. And so we tried to put some practical things in motion. So we set up an essay award prize that was specifically for undergraduates, that would for writing papers that were related to early modern studies and race, broadly defined, to try and encourage more of that kind of work. We tried to dialogue more with those students so that they would feel more, again, who is being brought in, like that they would feel welcome at Strode events and not it seeming to them like exclusive events only for graduate students. And I think that the other thing I would say is that one of the conversations we had, and it was certainly something that I tried to do beginning when I joined the program as director in 2016, is to think about Shakespeare as big as possible. And I'm kind of borrowing, Marge Garber has talked about big Shakespeare right before, and thinking about the broad reach it can have. And I think that's so important, right, for thinking about a public university, but there's we're a sort of endowed program within a department in a public university in a college town. And so how you can think about the broadest reach, really, of what Shakespeare can do. That's about access, certainly, but it's also about who can participate, right, and who is considered a Shakespearean practitioner. And so in terms of another practical, I think, thing we turn to, interestingly, I don't know if other programs have experienced this as well, but we saw an increase in our applications for the MA and the PhD in the years after. And so that gave us some opportunity to think about, okay, what are we doing for recruiting, and how can we, the program at the graduate level has been predominantly white, and how can we do a better job of reaching a broader range of applicants, and and finding and making our program attractive that they would consider coming and finding a home. And we did start, for instance, conversations with regional HBCUs about starting some pipeline programs, because you really have to start as early as possible. You can't just hope that the applicants come, right? You have to think about what you're doing at all stages, I think, of the educational system, and that takes time, right? And you have to build those things. So we started those things. I think it's hard, right? Bureaucratically, there are some roadblocks, and sometimes because of the fact that we are a degree granting program within a department, there's certain kinds of restrictions or just limits on what we're able to do that may or may not be the case for a standalone program. But those were some of the things that we talked about very pragmatically, and I definitely, I think even in our programming, and this is something that came up in the discussions yesterday as well, about some of the advantages of digital. I think it was Jonathan who brought that up with the archive, right? And thinking about digital Zoom programming or hybrid programming can offer access certainly to, especially because we're a regional, Tuscaloosa doesn't have an airport even. You have to fly to Birmingham and drive an hour, right? So we're not the most convenient place for people to come necessarily if they're going to come for a individual speaker, right, or a program. So thinking about how we can broaden that reach through access to digital platforms that are out there so that we're not just, inviting people to come to our corner of the world, but also saying what can we offer beyond, right, beyond our campus. And I think that is an ongoing, it's a challenge. And I think especially perhaps in a small college town, it can be a challenge about thinking about reaching those broader publics, but it's something that we're in ongoing discussion about.
Thank you. Ian, how about, I don't know if you want to address it from your work with the Shakespeare Association or Lafayette College, whichever institution you would like to address.
I'll try from my local institution, Lafayette College. Needless to say, I'm not in the position, like my two other panelists here. I don't run a program at Lafayette. I'm just a regular faculty member trying to do his job, right? And so I don't make those sort of bigger decisions. But so I'll say, but I'll attempt to respond to your question and add to the conversation if I can by saying this. Well, Lafayette, like any good liberal arts college, tries to do the right thing and sees itself as trying to do the right thing. And like most colleges and universities, have adopted the language of some kind of inclusion and diversity and so on and so forth. It is true that in my department in particular, there's been a history that we have been on the forefront of hiring more diverse people. That's a historical fact, so kudos to the department in doing that. And then others have sort of followed us, as best as they can. So for that I'm very proud, and for that I'm very happy. That's part of the reason too why I've stayed. I've stayed there because it's a liberal arts college, and I've been speaking to some folks I've met here who are teaching liberal arts colleges, and I support liberal arts college institutions and what they do because, as Nataki was saying this morning, when she was talking about the importance of theater reaching out to its audience, I love the way she talked about reaching out to its young audience and what that means. And I don't think she was speaking from a purely instrumental point of view, i.e. if we get them now, we'll get them forever and they'll fill the theaters. That's not what I think she was saying. There was a sense of real commitment to reaching out to young people. If we believe that Shakespeare can have some real value, then why not introduce this thing in a way that will be transformative, useful, helpful to younger people, as we would want to give young people anything that's good and valuable. Well, liberal arts colleges are really all about centering students. And so what she said there moved me very much, and I do believe in that work. And as I said, that's why I've stayed there for so long. One of the things I think then about coming out of the pandemic is that it raises the question for me about to what extent have we losing that sense of contact, commitment to students in a particular way. That is to say, and I'm not saying that it happened because of the pandemic. I think there's a trend, and the pandemic simply exacerbated the trend. 10 years ago, my sense of students being the center of all of our attention, I think, was much greater. I sense an attenuation of that. It's not quite the same. You may have answers for why that may be so. I'm not quite sure why that is so. But it saddens me because I think it's a loss of our mission. And it's a promise we make to parents and students when they come to liberal arts college that we will give your students that kind of attention. And when we don't do it, we're failing and reneging on the promise and commitment that we've made. And that can't be right. And so I think that with the pandemic and people sort of being isolated, not in the same space, we saw the impact on students. We have seen the impact on students. Students feel alienated. Students are still suffering from that sense of alienation. I was genuinely sort of surprised last fall when students and faculty both came back together, and students were raring to get back together. In fact, they came back at my institution spring of 21, even though they were still taking classes online. So it was this weird thing where students, we want to be around each other, even though the faculty weren't there in the classrooms teaching, so they would still take classes from their rooms and so on. And so last fall, when we all came back, students started to, little by little, talk about their sense of not being connected. And that threw me. I couldn't quite understand what that was, even after they expressed such real desire to be around each other and to be with each other. But something had changed. So those are some of the issues that concern me. And ultimately, the work that I'm committed to, which is not just teaching, but the work on teaching Shakespeare and race, which is what I do, the question is, what is the value of that for students going forward? Now, I'm sure we'll come back and say some more about that later on. But I think that work is really important because what are we doing when we have undergraduates in our care for 4 years? We're not just stuffing their heads with knowledge, in that sort of almost Dickensian way. That's not what we're doing. We're trying to prepare them and give them skills that they can use while they're in college and certainly for life after college. And life after college is not just about having a job, although that's critical and important. Life after college is about how you're going to be in the world. How are you going to live with other people in the world? How are you going to engage with others in the world? And make a commitment to yourself about the kind of person you want to be in the world. Race is a critical part of that if we understand and remember truly that the history of this country is founded in a racial paradigm. And if we're going to help students get to that place where they can live within this racial paradigm, transform that racial paradigm, and make a different and better and more transformative one, a more humane one, then the job of teaching, the job of interacting, the job of scholarship, the job of going to the archives is not just so that I can publish a new book, as nice as that may be. That job is how do I then take that information and bring it back to the classroom and make myself a better educator and a better conversationalist and a better person who exists in dialogue with my students so that they can benefit and be better prepared to be better citizens, because this is part of the building of democracy, as I understand it. That's what we're trying to do.
Yes.
I can only... Oh, you tease me.
It wasn't just me.
I can only hope that we can do this job and do it better. Because I see this decline among faculty in wanting to spend time with students. I see the decline in students wanting to come and spend time with faculty. And at first I thought, why are students not wanting to come to see us? And it occurred to me that, well, it may not be just that students don't want to come to see us. Maybe we have sent the signal to students that we don't want them to come to see us. Because we're too busy. We're too preoccupied. And that can't be good enough. So.
I think what you're articulating mirrors what's happening in theaters, but I'm going to turn to Oskar because, of course, if the point of a liberal arts education is to help people be better citizens in, a multiracial democracy that we have, I think that has to be the goal of theater as well. And I'm wondering Oskar, what you've experienced with audiences recently. Have you seen a shift in audience engagement? Is there, I mean, you can talk about numbers and figures if you want, but like, is there something different happening? Because, I mean, we've gone through some serious trauma, and so does that manifest itself in the way that audiences engage or not with the shows?
Sure. And it's hard for me to generalize about what exactly that is, other than to say that the audiences have not entirely come back. And as I've said a couple of times in private conversations with people here, if we do a hit show, the numbers and the composition of the audience looks very similar to what it looked like in 2019. But if we do a show which has mixed response, we take a 30 or 40% cut. And we take a high in terms of who shows up. And also, there's been some real damage to our diversity of our audiences, particularly at the Delacorte. And there's a number of reasons for that. The biggest one is that the COVID interrupted our borough library distribution system, which is the sexiest title you can imagine. But something that we started about 8 years ago that has made a big difference is we've paired up with the library systems in all of the outer boroughs, and we've made them ticket distribution hubs. So we distribute the tickets in the outer boroughs at the libraries, and we always do other activities with the library, and they become great partners. And we couldn't do that during the shutdown, that we couldn't work with the libraries in that way. So we saw over the previous 8 years, our numbers at the Delacorte, which is our only really big theater, it's 2,000 seats, had gone from being 71% white to being 62% white, which is not where we need to be, but it's a huge step towards where we need to be.
And it's still more diverse than most New York theaters, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But you know, this is...
Except for the Classical Theater of Harlem. Sorry, Carl.
Oh, I don't know. I'd probably, put us up there. We'll arm wrestle about it afterwards. But the thing that I'm really always thinking about is how I love the talk this morning about our legacy and the fact that it's impossible to understand what we're doing except in the historical context of where we've come from and where we want to be going. And that is just so true, and I'm one of those people who believes that the Constitution is a living document that needs to continually be changed, and how we think of it needs to be changed as we move forward. Just as the term inclusion is ever expanding. You're never done. There's always more people who can feel ownership of the culture and say it. Free Shakespeare in the Park started with the idea of removing the economic barriers to going to Shakespeare. It succeeded. It succeeded so well that this program that was created for access became the hardest ticket to get in New York City. We'd eliminated the economic barriers, but who the heck is going to get up at 6 a.m. to wait in line for 6 hours to get a ticket to a Shakespeare play that night, or in certain cases sleep overnight in Central Park? Let me tell you, limits the demographic. So in response to that, we recreated the mobile unit, and we have a beautiful mobile Shakespeare unit that goes around to all of the boroughs, to prisons, to parks, to halfway houses, and also different places. And it's a fantastic success in that it's the only program we have where the demographics of the audience exactly match the demographics of New York City. There's no air between them. And it's really, we go to where people are, and when you go to where people are, you can make, but still, there's, and Nataki, I have your voice inside my head, so forgive me if I'm projecting, but there is still something kind of colonialist about that idea, right? We've got culture, we're taking it out for you. Many things we try to do to mitigate that, but it's still true. So what's the next boundary is, how do we get our communities to make Shakespeare? So with the leadership of the brilliant Mayor de Bessenay, we started our public works program, which is forming relationship with community-based organizations around the 5 boroughs, keeping those relationships going all year long with classes, with potlucks, with trips to the theater, and then at the end of every summer producing a huge pageant, which is in the Delacorte Theater, the same theater that Meryl Streep and Al Pacino and James Earl Jones trod those boards, a 200-person Shakespeare, usually a musical adaptation musical, the casting consisting of 5 of our best, greatest professional actors and 160 plus community members, many of whom had never been on stage before. And I knew this was like good social work, right? I knew it'd be good for people. What I didn't know is the best art we produce all year. And the shock that happens between the audience and the stage when they're literally the same people. You know, they're not after seeing themselves in a professional actor, but literally they're friends and neighbors. People just like them are up there performing. It's transformative on the nature of the event. And I'm going on too long. But this is the one thing that I want to talk about, because for me, the frontier that I'm seeing that is so challenging and interesting is how do we actually blow up this idea that our profession is the professional theater? Because that distinction between professional and amateur seems to me actually it's holding us back in many, many ways. And what our real job is to see how we as theater practitioners can use the tools of theater to do what it's supposed to do, which is increase liberation, democracy, and enfranchisement among everybody. And for that, that's a different relationship suddenly to making theater. It's a different relationship to, and I don't know where that's going to lead, but for me coming out of the pandemic, that's the horizon that I think is really exciting. Because if we do that, we can matter to way more people than we matter to right now. And if we don't matter to way more people than we matter to right now, I don't think there's any standing still. I think we're going to go backwards.
Oh, we absolutely will. Because I mean, there is a future in which theater is just musical theater based on movies, right? Like that is a potential reality.
Well, and where theater is a commodity to be purchased, which of course much of the commercial theater is right now. You're not doing what you really should be doing when you're going to the theater, which is yearning for participation in a live experience between the stage and the audience. And I said this at dinner last night, that I often think that the plays are just the instrument. They're tools for turning the audience into a community. And that's when the theater is really successful, when it transforms how these people out here relate to each other.
Yes.
That's when it's really exciting. And again, that's not got to do with buying a commodity.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder if I can push you just a little bit further on this idea to turn to Michelle and Ian and say, if this is where you think the frontier is there room for scholars in this process? And if so, how? Like, how can we, continue with this deprofessionalization? Is there a way for us to be in that process?
Yeah, well, I assume that that's a trick question because you're part of it at the bottom. And what I actually feel is that's another one of the silos that we have to break down. The idea that the academy and the intellectual study of Shakespeare is somehow separate from the experiencing and production of Shakespeare. That's actually terrible. It's terrible for Shakespeare, it's terrible for our society. What has been beautiful is with Jim Shapiro, to have scholars enmeshed in the rehearsal process, because that is sort of, again, making the statement, there is no black line between the experience of making theater and the reflecting and thinking and theorizing about making theater. They should be in dialogue with each other all the time. And Greg said in the panel this morning, it's great to have people who know a lot in the room. It's a wonderful, and of course you can't predict exactly what's going to happen because it's going to be different for different scholars, different for different productions, different directors, actors. But what is a big statement that we're not accepting this silence. We're not accepting, there's a real tradition of anti-intellectualism in the American theater, which I know Barry and I have spent our careers trying to fight. And there's also an anti-theatrical prejudice in the American Academy, which we have to fight.
There absolutely is. There absolutely is. And in fact, for those of you in the scholarly realm, you'll know that there are not a lot of graduate students working on performance. And I know we've got some young scholars here who shout out to them because they are trying to break that silo as well. So Michelle and Ian, I wonder if what do you see as the kind of next frontier in the next 25 years, and how can, in your scholarship, in your teaching, how can that intersect with the theater in a way that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, Oskar, as you were speaking, it made me think so much about, flipping that about how much I think students, graduate students, even those who are going on to do book history projects and projects that seem perhaps to some not to have anything to do with performance, need the theatrical as well. And one thing that the Strode program has had a long history before my directorship of having links to the theater. We have one of the required classes that's been on the books for all our MA and PhD students for a long time is a Shakespeare in Performance practicum. And, I taught it for a few years, but I team taught it with someone in theater. And then we have a new colleague, Elizabeth Tavares, who is a scholar, but also performance.
She's amazing.
Yeah, she is amazing. And shout outs to her. She is a dramaturg and a Shakespeare in Performance scholar, among much other research that she does. And she has transformed one of our kind of informal, we used to have an informal kind of reading group, sort of putting plays up on their feet that grad students would do, and she took that over and transformed it into the Alabama Shakespeare Project, which is a performance research-based collective that is really engaged with putting up shows, but also asking certain kind of research questions that are designed by students, like grad students, right? So let's think about cue scripts, and let's try, to do Shoemaker's Holiday with cue scripts and what happens, and then talking to the audience members about how did you find that? And for a lot of those audience members, most of whom are undergrads at the University of Alabama, that was their first time ever being in a theater, or in a theatrical production. So that's, I strongly agree that, it certainly was not, I agree with you, Ayanna, that I think it's unusual to have in a traditional, I guess, PhD program or MA program in English, a kind of performance. But we do attract students, I think because of that history, who do have some performance interest. And I think it's a really, I think it's important synergy for all of our students to have those experiences. So that would be, one thing I would say. I have more thoughts about the 25.
Yeah, please go ahead.
But I don't want to. So I was just thinking about. You asked about what are some of the defining, I guess, conversations or characteristics in scholarship that have defined the last 25 years and maybe looking forward, right? And I was thinking about this a lot, and I really think for me, what it comes down to, and this is probably putting it in the broadest terms possible, is a kind of a meeting point between kind of historicist and presentist concerns. I know that there's sort of a debate, for a while in at least early modern literary studies about presentism versus historicism, which I always think kind of missed the mark because it seemed like the real value was in bringing these things together, right? And thinking about that everything we do is presentist because of who, we're doing it now. We are who we are, right? And that matters. And that doesn't mean that we can't look back, historically to guide our thinking or to perhaps, change our thinking in some ways. I mean, I think of it in two of the Renaissance being the Janus face, right? Looking back and looking forward, so the classical past and looking toward modernity. But really, I think of it, in our kind of modern critical sense as looking back in order to move forward, right? That this is why we need the Renaissance and the past, why we need Shakespeare. But it's not to just go back or to just look back and kind of in an antiquarian way, but it's to animate that, right? And to think about what we can use the past for to help us move forward, right? And I'm always inspired by my students and the kinds of work they're doing. I mean, the Strode students are doing amazing work that kind of blends these things. So the master student now who's working on the staging of the Turk in early modern drama, she's a Turkish student, so she's really she's looking at documents that people haven't really looked at before. And, we have people working on book history, but they're looking at speech prefixes and how it affects things like questions of identity and race and gender. So these are all topics that another project I supervised a few years ago was on graphic novel adaptations of Shakespeare, right? So thinking again about adaptation. And so to me, those kind of projects, what students are working on, what I see them bringing their interests in, that's the future. And I really see though that almost all of those projects blend a kind of historicist inquiry on some level, linguistic or textual, or thinking about early modern constructions of identity, but really centered in our contemporary moment and their concerns. And I really think that whatever the next developments in the field are, that those kind of conjunctions are going to be the most fruitful, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Well, so many things happened here that I sort of was going very quickly.
Hold forth.
No. So can I be a little bit misbehave and go back to an earlier question?
Absolutely.
So I'm going to, I know this is not my job, but I'm just curious. Oskar, you said earlier in your last response, you're talking about the function of theater and its richest sort of sense that it should be sort of reaching those edges of pressing towards democracy and so on. And I couldn't help but wonder, how and when did it lose that function? So I'm not looking for a long, because I know that could be 10 volumes, right? But
and I can talk too much, yeah.
No. I would love to hear you, but I don't want to put too much pressure on you, but I'm just asking, I'm really just curious, when and how do you think that was lost? And then I'll come back to your question, Ayanna, if that's okay.
Absolutely, that sounds great.
Really quickly, I don't think it's ever been entirely lost, and I don't think it's ever been entirely gained. I think there are moments of great theatrical flowerings, and it's not coincidental that those are moments of great dramatic, democratic expansion. Athens, Elizabethan England. Shakespeare was a great playwright for one primary reason, which is he was speaking to the most diverse audience that had sat in any Western theater since Athens for 2,000 years, and he had to find a way to talk to all of them at once. He had to find a way to talk to illiterate groundlings, aristocrats, Oxford and Cambridge graduates, and not only talk to them, but take them all through the same journey. Because I remember I got taught when I was a kid that these comic parts were for the groundlings, and that's why they're in prose, and these high verse parts are for the. And anybody who's actually sat through a play, no, it doesn't work that way. You can't do a play where half your audience checks out for 10 minutes and expect it to work. What it's actually doing is he's opening that wide aperture so that everybody can experience it together, so that they can feel a sense of themselves as a polity. They are an identity. And I would say that the 30s in New York and across the country with the Federal Theater Project was a similar moment. So there are moments where the theater is both encouraged by democratic expansion and encourages that. It's both. And we're always in history, in process, fighting it. Right now, really quickly, because the president-elect complained about Hamilton in January of 2017 when we read a letter from the stage to Vice President-elect Pence when he was in the House. And I will tell you, Pence behaved beautifully. The entire House booed him when he walked in, and he turned to his son and said, "That's the sound of democracy." And he stayed in the lobby, admittedly, and listened to the whole speech, but the president flipped out. And there was a move to boycott Hamilton online, which got a couple 100,000 signatures. And I looked at this and said, this is nonsense. They're not boycotting us, we're boycotting them. None of these people was going to be able to afford a ticket. If they could, it wasn't going to come to a theater near them. And even if it did come to a theater near them, they don't have the connections, they don't have the in to get one of those tickets. We've turned our back on the majority of this country. And it's not just defined by race, although and income, that's a big part of it, but it's also the fact that this country is split into two cultures, one of which the nonprofit theater has basically said, "Thank you, we don't have anything for you, we'll move on." And we have to stop that if we're going to participate in trying to weld this back into one country. We've got to figure out some way that the fine arts, that the serious theater is not only confined to people who live in blue bubbles, or in a way we're just reinforcing this sense that we are two different countries heading for war with each other. So that wasn't a direct answer to your question, Ian,
no, thank
but
you.
it's what I think.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Ayanna, for allowing me to ask that. And this morning, at some point, you said capitalism. My guess is your answer might be what made that disruption would be, because the word commodification was used, you might think capitalism played a part in that sort of, whenever that split occurs, that might be so.
Absolutely, and it did occur with, the robber barons who built theaters that, where there used to be lots of little theaters, then there was just one, right? So, yeah.
And we can see even something as indirect as the authorship controversy, which is at its root entirely about class struggle, the idea that it needed to be an aristocratic Cambridge graduate who could be the greatest writer in the English language. That really bursts into life around the revolutions of 1848.
Yeah.
Just at the time when there's a possibility of the people actually taking the culture back, it's part of the thermidor, it's part of the backlash against that.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And there is a great book about how Shakespeare became high culture called Highbrow, Lowbrow by Lawrence Levine. It still holds up, so I would shout out to that text.
Okay, so to your original question, and thanks for bearing with me. In the last 25 years, the answer is obvious, I think, to you, and the answer is obvious to, I see dear friends in the audience, Amberine, Lisa. That's just in the last 25 years, the thing that has made the most impact on me personally and my career is, of course, the emergence of early modern race studies, right? I say it's obvious. It's obvious because I think it was something new, something, I say radical, not radical because I think it was disruptive, radical because, radical meaning off the root. And so it spoke to what was fundamental to our country, to our history, to our experience. So it was radical in that sense, meaning it belonged to us, but for so long we never considered it part of our root or our roots, to sort of refer to an older kind of, history. And so that's what was so critical to me over the last 25 years. And it continues to be so. I must say thank you to Ayanna herself for the role she has played in this. And I say this because yesterday morning in your opening remarks, I think you used the word atomize, if I'm not mistaken, right? And in effect, what I think happened is during the 90s and the early 2000s, there's a sense in which individual scholars, somewhat in a lonely way, producing great scholarship, good scholarship, superb scholarship, but there was always the pushback and the backlash to that scholarship, right? It's not Shakespeare. It's not us. The same kinds of things that Erica Wyman was speaking about yesterday, right? About not belonging, or people sort of putting up walls of ownership, and some was saying, well, you don't belong in the Shakespeare circle. If you're doing this radical, remember, this root-based work in American history. Irony, okay? So, people were just doing this work on their own. And the names Kim Hall, Arthur Little, Margaret Hendricks, Joyce MacDonald. And in recent years, I think what has become important, and in particular with the Race Before Race initiative that Ayanna has sponsored, I think her timing was perfect, and what she did was so critical, which is to say, she created a moment, but also a center around which all these sort of atomized pieces of scholarship and these atomized feelings among scholars, and these sort of scholars, the few of us, splintered all over the place, could come together and feel that there was a center to this work. It gave it an identity, it gave it a place, it gave it a body, it gave it a presence. And so we moved from the sort of fragmentation of the atomization to a sort of central, cultural, solidified sort of thing that graduate students could look at and say, hey, there is this thing called early modern critical race studies, pre-modern race studies, and that's what I want to do. That work is the work that Ayanna has really done through her wonderful timing, energy, boundless and endless energy, and brilliance. Thank you so much. So that's...
I'll pay you later.
So that's the work that has been so important, I think, for someone like me, and I think for a lot of us who are doing this work for the last 25 years. For the next 25, I say the work continues, right? I don't know if we will resolve that kind of radical work in 25 years. I mean, 2050 sounds far away, but it's only 25 years. It's not that far away.
Yeah.
Right? So that will not be resolved. Would I like to see other things added? Yes. I'd like to see queer studies joined to race studies, because I think I certainly have a personal interest in it, but here's the thing. Our young people have really adopted a much wider sense of queer identities than perhaps those of us who are older have. If we're going to continue to speak with, to, among them, we have to also then think about the ways in which we think of these identities in that sort of complex, intersecting way that they do. So we can't then sort of reside behind a kind of the walls of just race only, although that has a critical important place, but create other spaces for this sort of work to intersect and happen, because it speaks to that audience. And, if I might say something more, we can't forget our undergraduates, which we were speaking about before, and we can't forget our high school kids, right? Look, if we stay with graduate students only, we have an audience that's this small. Mm-hmm. This is what we've been doing for a long time. We've been speaking to professional scholars among ourselves, which is this small. Then graduate students, a little bit wide. Imagine what we can do if we speak to undergraduates and high school students. So Ms. Kinney, that's her name? I met her earlier today, who brought the students who were here yesterday. She had to leave. Well, we'll give her my thanks. She brought high school students. That's our audience.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Why limit ourselves to 10% when we can have 80 or more? And I can say more after.
I will always listen to you, Ian. This is so brilliant. May I add to that?
Yeah, please.
Continuing along the lines of thinking about the way we have atomized our field, we can't talk about race without talking about queerness and gender and sexuality. We also cannot talk about, because the young people are interested, they are also really, really worried, as they should be, about the oncoming climate catastrophe. Yep. If we do not talk about the fact that the climate catastrophe is destroying the global south, who did not create this problem, and we can't just talk about that as a phenomenon of the 21st century. Hello, it goes back to imperialism. So there is a reason why pre-modern studies is so important for the moment right now. And if that doesn't happen in the theaters as well, again, I think the young people will resist it. If it doesn't smell authentic, if it doesn't smell like it's addressing the real problems that we're experiencing right now. So anyway, I'm off my horse.
No, it's a good horse. Just to be the old guy that I am here, I also want to say that they may not be pressuring us for this kind of knowledge, but we've got to figure out how to talk about class too.
Yes.
And the confusion and at times the absence of economic categories and understanding the economic motor of now almost hegemonically the entire world is, I think, just crippling for a lot of the young activists I know, because it's just crucial. You can't understand what's going on.
No, and it does speak to the point you made earlier about the fact that theater is willing to cut off and disinvite a large segments of our population because they can't afford it. Right? And that if you're like, oh, too bad you live in a red state and there's no theater there, it's pretty...
Right, and when we say can't afford it, we also need to sort of expand this category. It's not just that individual Trump voters can't afford to buy theater tickets. Of course, most of them can. It's that they live in communities that don't support the nonprofit theaters enough to give them a theater to buy a ticket to. It's not, you know, it's not just about individual economic wealth. It's about communities.
It's about the capitalist structure, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, and I think you're absolutely right to say that there's probably a really important way in which, early modern Shakespeare scholars and theaters that do a lot of Shakespeare work to think together about how we can collaborate, to think about ways that class informs or doesn't inform current discussions, right?
Yeah.
So, okay. What conversation, so this actually, is probably the last question that I will ask of just amongst us, and then I will open it up to our amazing audience. Along these lines, what conversations or creations would you like to have in the next 25 years, but are not possible currently without some sort of collaboration or intersection between practitioners and scholars? Are there things that you imagine that you would like to do in the next 25 years, which is the medium future, not the long-term future, that wouldn't be possible without some sort of collaboration? And Michelle, I'll turn to you first.
Sure. There's a lot of things I'd love to do. And some of them are, I think, building on things that are collaborations that we already have or that already exist, and maybe pushing the boundaries of those further. So, for example, the University of Alabama is a member of the Folger Consortium, so that is like a direct institute that we collaborate with, and that our students are able to take courses there and faculty. But one thing that happened, right, with the Folger being closed and then with COVID, is that many of the programs, as many of you know, probably went out to instead of just being all at the Folger, right, they're housed at different universities. And so my colleague in the Stroke program, Cassie Smith, and a few of her colleagues in history hosted, it was online, but there's going to be an in-person in Alabama version workshop seminar coming up this spring on early modern intersections in the American South. So thinking about a site-specific, but combining the resources of the Folger with the site-specific work in Alabama, and bringing people there. And so I would love to see more of, and that obviously requires resources from different institutions, from people, from, across the region, certainly, but across the nation. More of that. And I think for me too, the building, I go back to something I mentioned earlier about the difficulty of reaching more of the public, right? And finding collaborations that will move us beyond the University of Alabama's campus, right? And thinking about how we can do that given the limitations of our community. And I think that some of these partnerships with performance, right? That we've had, the first year I was at the Stroke program, we brought in a traveling the ASC's traveling production, and we underwrote that so that it was free and we put it on downtown, so it was not on the University of Alabama's campus, which provides another kind of access barrier for some people. So we had it at downtown, open to the public, free, Romeo and Juliet, Two Gentlemen of Verona, and it was actually a big success. We got a lot of buzz. So, more of those kind of events, kind of sustained, I think, momentum of those kind of collaborations, right, that would enable us to take what we're doing, again, right now, in many ways it can be a very small group, right, graduate students, faculty, but I think that the reach of what the program's doing and what our students are doing is so much broader than that, potentially. I mean, they're, as I said, they're doing such amazing things. I would love to be able to have more of those kind of, public-facing collaborations.
For the future, I in a little bit like what Michelle is saying, I'm going to refer to something that I have tried and worked on, and hopefully can build and expand that in the future. In 2016, when we were all thinking about the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death, I thought, well, what could we do at my small institution. And so I went to our college president at the time. She's since left, by the way. She left last year.
Where did she go?
I'm forgetting out, yes.
Somewhere fabulous.
Yes.
She's a great president.
Yes. And I said, well, can we do something? And she said, sure. And she underwrote it, and she said, let's do something. And then she said, well, maybe we can do something, build on that and do something bigger the next time. And I thought, oh, that's administrative speak, so. And then she came to me again, she says, well, are we going to do this again next time? And I'm thinking, oh, you're serious? And so she underwrote out of her own budget for the first year an event. And the event was one that I wanted to work on, which was, again, bringing scholars, high-powered scholars, to undergraduates, and to try to make that intersection happen, and also to bring in a theater person. And in that year, we brought in Keith Hamilton Cobb. He had been performing his American Moor. And the scholars I brought in, of course, Ayanna Thompson, Kim Hall, Peter Erickson, and Michael Whitmore. And so you can see we had a really robust and excellent group. And those 4 scholars committed to coming back every other year. And I was very grateful for them doing that. The pandemic disrupted that, so there is that problem. But they came, and so for me, what I was trying to do there was, as I said, bring that level of scholarship and theater experience and knowledge to undergraduates, and just see what would happen over time, because it doesn't happen overnight, as somebody said before. And so perhaps I'd like to see more of that in the future. And yes, I do believe that you have to bring, in fact, together the theater work and the scholarly work, the critical work, and of course, it's always fun to have the people like Ayanna and Kim and Peter and Michael in the room to make it a very lively offering. And we try to find different ways to have them interact with students, and I think some of that worked fairly well and was pretty exciting. On one other occasion, we had Iqbal Khan from the RSC, he works at the RSC from London, to come in as well. And I remember Michael doing an interview with him, which was just brilliant. And that is one of my highlights of that year, and then students getting to hear that conversation and really being very moved by that conversation and talking about that. So it really was a way to educate, engage, have dialogue with students, and perhaps there's a way we can build on that going forward, again, to sort of bring this sort of exchange about race and what I call racial literacy to students as well, undergraduates.
I love what you guys are talking about high school students and undergraduates. I would love it if over the next decade we could create a library of filmed Shakespeare live performances that are resolutely American, that we get, no offense, Brits, but I mean, for example, like Kenny Leon's All Black Much Ado, or Saheem Ali's Black African Diasporic Merry Wives, which we've done in the park the last few years, and we have beautiful films. I'd love to get a library of the whole canon that was available for free to every high school teacher in the country, with supporting educational material that is way more sophisticated and useful than what's currently available. It's the criminal. I'm still losing this argument with my Hamilton producing partners. I keep saying the thing we should do is release the rights to high schools.
Yes.
And let every high school in the country do it. And so the only place you can see Hamilton is one of our productions, or at your local high school for the next decade. And coming up from an inner city high school in Minneapolis, I know that would have transformed the theater department, and it would have changed the schools. It's finding ways that we can actually combine forces to create resources so that we're preparing for when the president announces the Presidential Council on Artistic Access, modeled on Kennedy's physical ability, physical health, or whatever you call that council. But so we actually make it a national priority that everybody has access to making theater and making art, that's something that should extend across society. And finally, the collaboration that I'd most like to do, and it would involve everybody, is creating a situation where we can think of the theater the way we think of the public library, that it's free, that it's just a resource, that you get it because you're here, and you can, just like you can walk in and check out a book from the public library, you should be able to walk in and see performances. And obviously that involves a macro change in our economic system, but just all of these different ways that we can expand not so much the reach of our productions as the use of theater as a way to bind people together and empower them.
Transform the use of theater. All right, let's thank the panelists, and then we'll open it up for questions. Amazing. Okay, we will have a mic coming around, so please raise your hand if you have a question. Oh, I missed it. Where's your hand?
On the aisle.
Oh, on the aisle. Yes, sorry. I have very bad eyesight.
Hello. I'm really inspired by the sort of conversation about local Shakespeare and the idea of not thinking about the way that we provide Shakespeare as between the metropole and the colony, or the parish, sort of reaching out in these, whatever format that is. And it occurs to me that in a way there's been funding mechanisms that have encouraged that way of thinking about how theater is delivered. That has been based on ideas about efficiency, and you come up with, say with the NEH, an idea of how to do a program, and it has to be replicable, and it has to go online. And this idea of the sort of who's at the end of that is somebody with a computer, but not a local theater. And so I'm wondering about, how to, when we're talking to our representatives, to talk about how the NEH, the NEA fund, and have it not be about how efficiently or replicably or scalability, but about place, locale, and community, and finding a way to do that may not be efficient, but may be powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I think if the NEA retooled their Shakespeare in American Communities funding model, which now primarily goes to wonderful institutions, but usually large scale, and it is very much a imperial model, like, oh, let us deliver this to you, poor people and wherever. What if that funding actually just went to a church or a local community theater or a retirement home, whatever, that wanted to put on a Shakespearean production? I think that transformation, that's one thing that could happen.
I would just say that from my experience, the way you get funding for new ideas is you do the idea without the funding, and you demonstrate how powerful it is, and you get people start lining up at that point. So for me, and obviously this is my prejudice about where I come from, but the idea would be figure out how to do something that actually speaks for itself, and then make sure you get the people in who can help support it, whether they're individual philanthropists, government. And sometimes in this country, government support is the last thing that happens, and you got to build up a lot of other things first. And again, not saying that's the way it should be ideally, but it's the way it is. And so, I found that if you can, and you don't need to worry about whether it's replicable enough, because you just need to experiment. You just need to try and do something that works and that you can feel work. And then once you've got that, it's a lot easier to think about, okay, now who do I need to bring into the tent so I can get more resources to continue this or to scale this up.
And maybe scale up is not the goal, right? Maybe it's just to have community dialogue and a sense of coming together for fun that may be based around a set of texts that are in the public domain.
Yeah, it's only because I think of it, forgive me for assuming you'd want to scale up, But what I'm saying is I want to figure out a way that we can nationally change the sense of what theater is there to do, which also means, I think, changing the sense of who gets to own Shakespeare and who gets to do it and who considers it valuable. And then maybe you don't have to scale it up, but some other people who are interested in scaling it up will scale it up. You know, we've got to figure out how to change the culture. It's not easy.
Just pausing to see. Okay. Other questions? I see you in the back. I'll get you.
Hi. I just wanted to bring up another point. I really appreciate all this for 2 days. I wonder, too, the view from the consumer's viewpoint. I was just thinking how lucky we were to live in Oregon and load up a carload of teenagers and go down to Ashland and have some of our best family vacations, going off to plays, meeting up in the evening, having dinners with these brilliant young teenagers who some have gone into the field. And if we hadn't had that, I'm sure we would have found some things, but just to have that memory and that practice. They never went to Disneyland. They never wanted to go to Disneyland. So I think a lot has to do with what is a consumer value, and maybe there are ways to really not so much get all this money and all these wonderful things, but hook in these people, make it a mainstream normal activity. You save up your vacation time and budget and head on down to Ashland and make it fun and sustain it over time, so it's a tradition. That might be another
You can
approach.
continue to go and support Nataki.
Yes, we try. But just that there's maybe that angle too, not so much, you're working so hard on your end. What about the other end? I also grew up in Minneapolis, and those rush tickets were $2 at the Guthrie. What a way to get started. It was so accessible.
Yeah, my dad had an apartment next door to the Guthrie, so I would go and see the second acts of all of the shows and just wonder. And it's actually why I think I became a dramaturg, is that I was always trying to go, okay, if this is how it ended, how must it have begun?
We had so much fun doing that. But maybe there's more from the consumer side. There are choices. Why go to Disneyland and spend? There's a lot of money spent at Disneyland, and not to, sorry, Disney people, but there are other choices, and it may not be so elitist, really. It's fun. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Amen. In the back.
Hello, thank you so much for coming out and for organizing this at a very local place. I'm from the San Gabriel Valley, so it's a really happy moment for me to make it here. So I think something that was very, hit home is how we're talking about that loss of public speaking as a skill. I think that both as a student and as a future educator, I notice a lot of my peers are definitely going into rooms, staring at each other, and we want to talk, we want to say something, but we are at a loss of words. So my question is, Shakespeare, what play would you use to engage or bridge that gap? Get us talking again.
They're all pretty good. The different things. I mean, we were moved to do Julius Caesar in the summer of 17 because the Trump rallies had actually revived the idea that public rhetoric, speech making, had a positive political impact, or had an extraordinary political impact, in a way that hadn't seemed to be true for the previous 30 years. It seemed like public speech. But, all of the plays have got beautiful relationships, have got beautiful dialogue, and the biggest thing is get them to do it. Because that's the reason why doing theater is, it's good for everybody's soul. It trains you in self-confidence, it trains you in verbal skills, it trains you in emotional intelligence and interactive skill and problem solving, and those are very different than reading. It's obvious to everybody in the room that Shakespeare didn't care about reading, he didn't care about publishing his plays. The artistic event was what went on with actors and performance. Then that thing that they used to get there was like the score of a symphony. Most of us don't sit home and read the score of the Ninth Symphony. We want to listen to it. And it's in the doing that it unlocks, and to my way of thinking.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And I would say, I think any of them, I mean, picking something that, resonates, with you is really the start. But I mean, I'm a big champion of measure for measure. Maybe, especially, in the, last, 5-10 years with the Me Too movement, right? But I mean, in terms of language and hearing it and thinking about whose words are believed and whose words aren't believed, I think it's a very powerful play that's kind of come of its moment. And so, I mean, I don't think you can go too far wrong really with any of them, but I'll put in a pitch for measure for measure.
That is so funny because I was thinking measure for measure too. That's the most bizarre thing. So yes, but I'll reiterate this, that any of those texts, any of the plays will do. I think the key here is if you can find something in any of the texts that excites you, a moment, an image, because that's what I think students remember. And you can sort of say, choose a thing that fascinates you, share that with them, create a conversation, and there you go, right? And which you can do with anything. But if it's Shakespeare, choose your play, choose your moment, choose your issue. It's there, and I think you just have a great go. But it's so interesting that I thought of measure for measure too.
Just to pile on the measure for measure bandwagon. Back when Barry was still at the Public running the Public Shakespeare Initiative, and we revived the mobile unit, the first show we did was Measure for Measure. Mm-hmm. Taking Measure for Measure into prisons was one of the most electric things I'd ever experienced, because suddenly that is a play that is entirely about arbitrary justice and injustice. And the wave of hate that would flow over the male prisoners when Isabella refuses to sleep with Angelo was just extraordinary, because for them, it was just absolute one-on-one connection. This sister won't do what needs to be done to save my life. What the hell? The response to Isabel being, exploited, oppressed by Angelo was extraordinarily empathic. A man in power demanding sexual favors from you, and you can't even report it because nobody's going to believe you. So it's very much who that audience is too. They all work, but Romeo and Juliet's good for kids because of love and death. Julius Caesar is often because I'm one of many people. Joe Papp was another one who the first speeches we memorized were from Julius Caesar. That rhetoric was incredibly attractive to me as a 13-year-old.
Somebody talked about King Lear this morning and said that was difficult to confront and difficult even now. And I remember reading King Lear when I was in high school, the equivalent of what they call the sixth form in sort of the British system. And I loved the play because just the power and the power of the story. But I also I wouldn't teach it for years because there was so much there about family, dynamic, treachery, and so on. And I thought, I've seen too much of that. And I thought, I can't teach that. And then eventually I said, well, I'm depriving students of a great experience. But that was like 20 years in when I just refused to teach it because it was just too close. So there you go. Some things you want to talk about because it's about family dynamics gone awry. Have at it. But as we've been saying, there's just so much you can do with any play, depending on what you want to talk about, or don't want to talk about.
Yep. I think. Oh yes, there's a question over here. Is that Erica? Okay. Yes.
Oh, thank you. I want to just return to a question that you asked, Ayanna, and something you said this morning about it, which is that it seems to me that across these 2 days there's a lot of consensus about wanting to make new meaning. And we've been saying it in a number of different ways about how we co-create with our communities, how we work together as scholars and artists. And I guess my question is there enough encouragement of scholarship that is actually evaluating that new meaning? So in addition to the scholarship that's looking, as we've talked about, how important the history is, the performance history and the history itself, and how important it is to look at how that interacts with performance choices. What is happening in the audience? What is happening to individuals who are interacting with it? Are we studying that in a way that helps us make better new meaning?
So, unlike scholars of film and television who have pretty sophisticated audience research, I would say the scholarship on audience reception in theater is still, at least 20 years behind. So I would say that that is an area that really requires a breath of fresh air from some new scholars, I think, because we have been stuck in a certain place for a while that sometimes relies on professional critic reviews as a gauge of audience reception, which is ridiculous. And then sometimes, does some sort of like focus groups with, some people after a show, which also I think is not quite there, as sophisticated as it can be, and sometimes relies on audience surveys. I would just say in other fields it's much more sophisticated and we're not there yet. So, hey, any early career scholars, you've got a rich, rich area to explore.
It's really true that in the absence of such scholarship, our default is the main research is the daily ticket wraps.
Yeah.
Is it selling or not?
Yeah.
And it's a form of research, but it's a pretty crude form of research.
Yeah.
Forgive me for coming back, but I guess what I hear in your answers I recognize, which is that the research we do is linked to the economics of how we do what we do on stages. And that's why we don't have, isn't that right? That's why we don't have great scholarship. Because what we've been talking about is a different economics, a different reason to make theatre or go to the theatre.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Other questions? Oh, there's one there. Mm-hmm.
So I have finally worked up my courage, and I now have the temerity to pose a question that comes completely from an outsider. I'm completely external to the world of Shakespeare studies. I, however, have long been the citizen of a pretty high-powered, the university where I have worked has a pretty substantial cluster of Shakespeare scholars, and I have often wanted to know why the issues that you all have raised so penetratingly, appositely, and compellingly today have only to apply to the circulation of the study of the performance of Shakespeare. It seems to me that there must be other powerful texts whose circulation and study could also produce the benefits that you have highlighted. And back to this gaggle of Shakespeareans at my university.
No, it's a murder of Shakespeareans.
Anyway, yes, one of these formidably imposing, impressive Shakespeare scholars did admit in a conversation with me not all that long ago that, yes, it was time to acknowledge that another formidable playwright named David Simon, who wrote something that everybody in this room knows, The Wire, was also on the same level. And why couldn't the Shakespearean not actually open out to being almost a kind of metaphor rather than literally demarcating only one particular body of works? Anyway, I don't know how this, I'm going to close my eyes now because I'm afraid of what you're going to say in response. But I just want to put that out there as literally a respectful question. Thank you.
Just two quick things. I've probably wasted much of the last 7 years trying to get David to write a play for the theater. Have not succeeded yet, but I'm not giving
So
up.
you agree with me, he's pretty good?
The Wire is the greatest narrative piece of the 21st century. I mean, it's an extraordinary accomplishment. But the thing I say is the very founding of the public theater, our building on Astor Place, was based on the idea that doing Shakespeare and delivering to the people was not sufficient. What we needed to actually do is take the voice of the people and put it on the stage and create a new canon and add to the canon. And that's what the public's been trying to do since 1967. So in our particular mix of Shakespeare and new work, it's not about privileging Shakespeare over any other writer. It's about saying, here's a standard which, as a culture, we've agreed is a very, very high standard, and by gosh, you can do a lot of really interesting things with him, but he's there precisely so, and he can be held up as a model for contemporary writing, and I will use 2 examples. Hair is based on Hamlet. It's just, you spend any time with it, it's absolutely clear. And Hamilton is about as Shakespearean a musical as I've ever heard of, and then it's not a coincidence that they sprang out. So that, I just want to say that dynamic relationship to Shakespeare is of the most interest in my book.
I really appreciate your question, and I have sort of 2 different responses from 2 different vantage points, so bear with me, I guess. So on the first point, I 100% agree that there are other writers other than Shakespeare, even in the Renaissance, right, who the questions that we've been discussing, critical race studies, gender, queer studies, can and should, right, be, we should look beyond Shakespeare to enrich in how we address those questions. And in my sort of other hat in my research, in addition to doing Shakespeare, I work extensively on early modern women's writing. So I'll throw that out there as like one, a body of literature text that is often siloed, right, and separated out from the work of Shakespeareans and the work of even mainstream, what we might think of mainstream canonical Renaissance studies. And I think there's a big missed opportunity there for thinking across those old dividing lines to thinking more expansively. Again, big Renaissance, big Shakespeare, where are there other texts, right? I absolutely agree with that impulse. On the other hand, I will say, for the why Shakespeare, I do think that Shakespeare's sort of sounds contradictory, but I don't mean it to be entirely, but that Shakespeare's canonical status does work in certain ways that can be useful, right? That his status can open doors, right? It can close them too. But it can be utilized for a lot of the reasons that people have been discussing the last 2 days about, bringing people in, about it being kind of ubiquitous, at least some exposure to Shakespeare in schools and stuff gives people at least a little bit of sense that they might have an entry. So I think that can be used for ill, right? And it can be kind of a deadening effect of a kind of, obligatory, right, Shakespeare. But I think that it can be used, as so many of the discussions in these panels have suggested, for really profoundly exciting and progressive ways. But that because Shakespeare is Shakespeare and he has that status, it does enable certain kind of work that, as much as I love Lady Mary Roth, at this moment, she's not going to be able to do that for us, I say with regret, right? It just, there's not that status culturally, right, enables us to do kinds of things with Shakespeare that I think are important as well.
There's too much to say and then too little. So let me give the too little version. What we heard this yesterday and this morning was about the pleasure of Shakespeare, whether it's by just the sounds and the effect the sounds may have, the cognitive pleasures the sound might also give you. And for me, let's just say that I enjoy working on Shakespeare. Now, sometimes I do get, and I don't believe that's what you're asking, but sometimes I do get the question, and Carl sort of raised this question as asked to him yesterday too, and it's like, why do you do Shakespeare? And that could mean, why do you do Shakespeare? Or it could mean, why do you do Shakespeare? Meaning, why do you, as a black person, do Shakespeare, right? And a man says, like, why not? And, you know, a story that I've shared, because I've been asked this recently, is, well, why, in fact, did I start doing Shakespeare? Well, one of the reasons is because when I was an undergraduate, I kept hearing he was great, right? And in a way, that's what Michelle just articulated, that he can do a certain kind of work, etc. But nobody explained to me what that greatness meant. And so I thought, well, in the absence of being told what that was this some sort of secret society? Was this some sort of thing that everybody knew that I could know? Or why weren't they telling me what that was? And so I thought, well, I need to figure that out for myself. So I went on that journey to figure out why that was so for me, whatever that was. And so there's a pleasure in it for me that runs the gamut. And so it's not for me now to just turn around and say, well, okay, I figured it out, because I haven't figured it out. And I continue to be able to use Shakespeare to ask important historical questions that can help me provide the kind of presentist answers that I'm looking for as well, and help students understand, let's say, for example, my interest in race as not just something that, you know, exists now, but understand sort of the history of what race looks like and why it has a history and how we can learn from that history or those histories as well. And finally, when I speak to students about, you know, leaving college and going on, again, I teach an undergraduate institution. Not all our students are going on to do graduate work like some of our good students here in graduate school. I say to them, look, when you go to a job interview, do not say, I love Shakespeare. Don't do that, as much as that may be true. Instead, speak about the skills you have learned as an English undergraduate. The skills of evidence gathering, the skills of evidence interpretation, data, etc. Speak about those skills, communication and writing. That's what, you know, because nobody cares, even they're hiring you for the most part, whether you love D.H. Lawrence or not, or Shakespeare or not. So there are many reasons why you might want to love Shakespeare and do Shakespeare, and there are many times when that may not be the foremost thing you want to talk about, because there are different goals that you have in mind in that moment. So for me, I do it because I love it, and I'm still on the journey to figure out why it is useful to me. And I say it because so often students want to know about the biography or people, and I'm thinking, I don't really care about biography, even about modern biographers as well. And I tell students in class, look, I'm not a biography person because having been trained in Shakespeare, I don't care. What I care about is the text and how I can sort of, you know, wrestle with the text.
I just would add quickly, it is impossible to separate the ubiquity of Shakespeare in our world from the military triumph of the English-speaking world over the planet. English became the lingua franca of the planet because of the British Empire, and therefore Shakespeare became the greatest author on the planet because that empire triumphed. We don't have to approve of it, but it's true. As Jonathan Bates said, if there hadn't been a storm in the English Channel in 1588, we would now be talking about the genius of Lope de Vega. And, you know, we need to recognize that, and the fact that a figure who we can have a common dialogue about is still of use, even if we don't approve of the method by which he became the figure that we have a common dialogue about.
I think we have time for one last question, so if you've got one, this will be the final question. Come on, don't be timid. Peter? Oh, Peter, there you go. Any hands? Okay, we got one. Oh, Mike Whitmore. All right, oh God, we're gonna be here a long time. Joke.
So I don't know when we'll have a gathering of this type again, and given the people who are in the audience, what would happen if we committed as a group to bringing a radically inclusive vision of Shakespeare in performance and in the humanities classroom to high schools and colleges around the country? Who would need to be involved, and what would it need to look like?
And we're at time.
That was short.
You know, but quite seriously, Michael, rather than try to bloviate about that, which, as you guys all know now, I'm perfectly capable of doing. It feels to me more that we should take that as a really pure provocation and actually just genuinely leave here thinking about that. And I'll try to come up with some thoughts and I'll email them to you, but just as a way of giving us an assignment, because it's a great provocation and a great assignment.
It would be truly transformative, and to use a word that Nataki used earlier and one that I use all the time when I talk about casting, is to be able to do that in high schools and talk about intentionality, I think would be hugely transformative for the way that both Shakespeare is understood and how those students, those diverse students, disability, sexuality, race, class, gender, etc., how those students would think about themselves and the way that they move through a community. So I think it's a great idea. It would take a lot of money. So that would be my thoughts.
No, Michael knows already that I'm on board with this idea. We
Yeah.
already talked about this as a great thing to do. So, sure.
And I'd also be interested in if there's a way of getting thoughts from our, not at this moment, but from our audience. Like if there's a way that people who are here today, if you have ideas, I don't know if there's any kind of a central email for this conference or something, but that it's not just us here that are, going to think of the ideas that are going to happen, but it's all you out there and hopefully people online and stuff, and the students who were here the other day and that kind of thing. So I wonder if there's ways to continue this conversation right beyond this room, but I'm sure you already have ideas about things that you want to do. I think that would be exciting.
Yeah, I mean, we should, I guess, contact the Huntington, or, my email is really easy to find, so it's ayanna.thompson@asu.edu, but there is an amazing plethora, wealth of knowledge, experience, generosity in this room, and I just want to thank everyone, and I want to thank the Huntington for making this possible. So thank you, everyone. Let's go hang out in the gardens.
Thank you.